Good morning or guten Tag, depending where you're joining us from. I'm Mike Vesey. Welcome to session 5 of 6. And I'm coming to you once again from the Austrian Alps, where it is stunningly beautiful today and the sun is shining. If you've been following the series thus far, you'll know that we've been alternating content that is of a more of a cognitive or conceptual strand with things that are more personal or interpersonal. And today's session, we're back in the cognitive or conceptual domain, and we're looking at the world of dilemmas or polarities. So our intention for this session is to look at tough choices that we might be having to make right now, dilemmas that we might be facing, and polarities. And we'll have a little look at the difference between a dilemma and a polarity and a paradox in just a moment. Not that we want to make this a lesson in sort of grammar and the English language, but the tool that we are going to share with you today, as is our practice on these sessions, is particularly suited for navigating polarities. So it's quite a good idea, first up, to understand whether you're dealing with a tough choice or whether it is in fact a polarity. In the second part of the session, I'm joined once again by Julie Allen. Thank you, Julie. And Julie, in the second part of the session, is going to give a more reflective take on perspectives this time in our digestive session. So let's kick off then and have a look at navigating dilemmas. Well, life is a series of dilemmas, really. From the moment we are born, the dilemma of breathing in and breathing out. We need to breathe in to take in oxygen, and we need to breathe out to exhale carbon dioxide. Most of us need to manage that quite quickly if we're going to move on and consider some of the other dilemmas. The other day I was, before lockdown and coming to Austria, I was with my nephews, and they're 4.5 and 6, and a little bit of bickering over who had what share of the Lego bricks. And I said to them, boys, here is a classic polarity here. If you can navigate how to look after your own needs with the needs of others, this is going to set you up really well for the rest of your life. And I could see my sister-in-law giving me a knowing look, saying, they are 4 and 6, Mikey. Maybe they haven't reached yet the developmental stage to really navigate that particular polarity. Anyway, I made a start. Other polarities that we have in our personal lives, whether to save or spend, one that perpetually trips me up. Work or rest, and that might be particularly pertinent for you in this current time where we're largely working and resting in the same place, maybe even the same room. And another one, given the COVID pandemic, might be how much to look at the news and attend to the reality versus a sense of hope. So life is a series of navigating a series of polarities or dilemmas. For those of you that are in a leadership position, these might be some typical polarities or dilemmas that you are grappling with. How much do I give my team freedom, empowerment, versus how much do I instill some sort of control or governance? How much to both challenge and support simultaneously? And perhaps one that is tested in current times, how much confidence do I exude as a leader when people are looking to me to have the answers, and I need to give some semblance that I know what's going on and what I'm doing, versus the need to show some humility. I haven't got a clue, guys. I'm in it as much as the rest of you. So those might be some typical leadership dilemmas, and there are many others as well. And organizational life, we see these dilemmas playing out as well. Should I attend or focus on the goals of my immediate team versus what about collaborating with the wider organization and trying to do what's best for the whole? And often our remuneration and reward systems can conflict with trying to navigate that. Should we be developing employees for the future, or should we be trying to work more efficiently to get more output in the shorter term? Should we be focusing on bottom line, or should we be doing what's best for the environment? Should our organisation be giving very clear instruction, direction and structure to people, or should in fact we be encouraging more flexibility and innovation? And I'm sure even as I cantered through that list there, you can think of many other polarities or dilemmas that you or your organisation or your family might be grappling with right now. And underpinning this idea of navigating a polarity or a dilemma is this developmental capacity, we call it, of fluidity of thinking, or sometimes also called opposable thinking. As we're navigating complexity, how do we get the best of both? How do we hold two seemingly opposable ideas in our minds at the same time and yet not go mad? And this is quite important for navigating complexity when there are no clear right answers. And if you think back to session 1 where we looked at the Cynefin framework, in complexity, cause and effect start to become rather murky, and therefore we're not sure which is right or wrong, and we need to tread quite gently through complexity, holding these different ideas in the mind simultaneously. And if you want, as a diversion, just to have a look a bit more about these ideas of developmental capacities which can support us to navigate complexity, they can be found on our website, but they're also in the book Upgrade, published by my friend and colleague Karen Ellis and Richard Boston on most good booksellers and also Amazon, if you must. Here we're suggesting, and these are in the slides for you to take away, an exercise that you might want to do with people back at the ranch. So if you are aware that there's a particularly knotty or recurrent issue that might seemingly be a polarity in your organisation, how might you use the tool that we're going to share with you today to bring together a mix of people from across different departments, different functions, different perspectives into the mix, and think, how do we navigate this polarity? How do we get the best of both rather than perpetually falling into this binary either or zero-sum way of thinking? Now, before I share the tool with you, just a little diversion into the difference between a dilemma, a paradox, and a polarity. Now, very often we will use these terms interchangeably, and the more pedantic amongst my colleagues might pick me up if I were to do so. So let's just give a little bit of what we think, or rather I've borrowed here from Brian Emerson, a friend in the States that we work with, his definition of the differences between a dilemma, a paradox, and a polarity. So a dilemma is essentially a tough choice. It's hard for us, but essentially it's a choice between two options. So for me personally right now, a dilemma is, do I stay in the beauty of the Austrian mountains where I have outdoor space, a balcony, stunning scenery, but it's rather socially isolating? Or should I try and make my way across several closed international borders back to London, where I would be nearer family and colleagues, even if I couldn't see them, and I'd have no outdoor space in my small London apartment? So that's not a polarity, that's a dilemma. That's a choice that I have to make. I can either be in Lech or I can be in London, but I can't do both, and they're not interdependent of one another. And that's the key difference really between a dilemma and a polarity. In a polarity, both need to exist over time. So like the idea of breathing in and breathing out, over a very short period of time, we need to breathe both in and breathe out. One informs the other. We might think of light and dark. Light and daytime really has no meaning without nighttime and darkness. Candor and diplomacy as well. So in a polarity, we're looking at two ideas which are the two sides of the same coin. And over time, we need a balance between those two things in order for maximum success. If we pull on one end or t'other for too long or too much, we find things get out of kilter, and there's a need to move to the other end of the continuum, or the polarity. Now let's just contrast polarity then with paradox. In paradox, we again have two seemingly interrelated elements, but we don't need to balance them over time. So the example I've picked up from Brian's book here is war and peace. You can't have too much peace. Too much peace does not drive you towards war. So that is the difference between a paradox then and a polarity. So we don't want to split hairs here, and I probably, as we go through today's session, will use these terms interchangeably, and some pedants might want to pick me up on that. But today we really are looking at the realm of polarities, and the tool that I'm about to share with you is best suited for navigating polarities. And therefore, the first thing you might want to do is ask yourself, is this a problem to be solved, albeit it's a tough choice for me, or is in fact a polarity something that might be an ongoing challenge or problem in your organization, where you're noticing there is this yo-yoing or oscillating nature between the two? And the tools that we would use for problem solving, the traditional problem solving tools of thinking about, well, let's weigh up the options here, are very suitable for the complicated domain in Cynefin terms. They don't help us to navigate or surf a polarity, and therefore they are less suitable for the complex domain. In fact, invariably, they tend to make the problem worse. And why do we think this is important? So why are we bringing this session to you today? Because often what can happen is a polarity starts to polarize within an organization. So you get different people, different groups of people starting to take different perspectives or different positions on the same continuum. And I've given some examples there of how polarization between more obvious groupings can occur, between perhaps managers and staff, employees who've been around for a long time versus new hands, between different functions or departments. Sales have gone out there and sold something and ops can't deliver. So those are typical polarizations that can occur within organizations. And that then leads to a rather sort of stuck discourse or dialogue when we start to judge the other. And it then falls into very much an us and them perspective. Oh, well, they are like that. That's so typical of that function, or that's so typical of that group of people. And we end up with caricatures of the other. And we can see many examples, not only in organizational life, but in societal life at the moment, as to how people are taking quite polarizing positions, not least enabled or fueled by the rise of social media. And you can see that particularly in societies like the US at the moment, where you've got, frontline health workers standing on a pedestrian crossing, blocking protesters who are calling for the lifting of the lockdown. So really quite entrenched positions taking shape. So that's why we think this idea of navigating polarities is potentially important. And the tool I'm going to share with you comes from Barry Johnson, and it's a polarity management map. So our start point is to say, well, there is a continuum here. That's the nature of a polarity, and we've got two poles. And we want to identify what is the potential continuum and the poles, and identify the nature of the interrelationship between those two poles. So here's an example that may make some of you give a wry smile, or you may be familiar with. It certainly is when I use this with groups that I work with. So here we've got, what type of organization design should we have in our organization? Should it be a very decentralized OD setup, or a centralized one? Someone normally comes along and in their first analysis, they notice what is going wrong in a system. So let's suppose we've got an organization that is highly decentralized and someone comes along, sometimes it's a management consultant, and they say, let's have a look at what data we've got here. We've got a lot of turf warfare. We've got a lot of silo working. We haven't got much collaboration here. We've got no economies of scale because everyone is kind of repeating the same activities. There's no joined upness across this organizational system. So what happens is usually then a new boss or someone comes along, some bright spark, and says, what we need to do is we need to solve this problem. So what do? We move to the other end of the polarity and we say, no, we need to bring things together here. We need to have some clearer rules for all. We need to have some economies of scale. Decisions need to be made at the center where we can drive efficiency and reduce all of this little fiefdoms that we've got within our system. After a while, what tends to happen is we start to notice the disbenefits of moving towards that end of the polarity. And at this point, given the alacrity with which leaders seem to churn these days in many organizations, is a new leader comes along and they notice what's not working about this organizational setup. We've got an insensitivity to local needs or to customer needs. Decision making is very bureaucratic. Everything is going up to committees at the center. Customers feel that we're not responsive enough in different geographies or to their needs. Employees feel that decision making is too slow. And in essence, we've got control freakery here. So what does the new CEO on his or her arrival do? Well, you've got it. They say, we need to move to a decentralized model. We need to get close to the customer, close to our local markets. We need to be very agile and make fast moving decisions. So they change the way the organization works, normally again bringing in another team of consultants to move the organization back to where it started from several years before. And that then becomes the nature of organizational life. And certainly my first 8 years, I worked for an organization which was centralized, and then we decentralized, and then we centralized. And I was usually on one of those project teams that said, this is the future, this is the way to go. And I hadn't quite realized this yo-yoing effect of moving everyone in one direction and then everyone back in another direction. And is it little wonder that with many of our change initiatives, people get very weary of these and they just think, if I just keep my head down for long enough, it will move in this direction and then it will move in that direction and nothing much really will change. In the English language, we might call this the grand old Duke of York syndrome. He marched them up to the top of the hill and he marched them back down again, up to the top and down again. That's a children's nursery rhyme for those of you that are from the UK. And I'm sure some of you are smiling and you recognize that pattern of organizational discourse. So in Barry Johnson's model, we want to try and identify how do we move away from this either or way of thinking to a both and way of thinking, where we can identify what are the positives of both ends of the polarity and get the best of both and avoid the worst features of both. And we do that to begin with by completing this grid. So this is where I'm going to need a little bit of audience participation and for you to find the chat function, please. So let's illustrate this with an example of looking at some of the polarities, tough choices, dilemmas that we might be facing with dealing with the present pandemic. And we had a little think before today's call. Some of the polarities that your organizations and indeed policymakers are grappling with, whether to attend to things that are particularly urgent, pressing in the short term, or whether to attend to what has the biggest impact, what might be most important. There's a big debate raging right now about how and when to lift Lockdown measures. Should we be focusing on the health and well-being of people? Should we be focusing on the economy? And you can see that debate really particularly raging, and as I said earlier, really polarizing groups of people, particularly in the US, but also elsewhere. Or as we come out of lockdown, what should be some of the criteria that we might be focusing on? Should we be trying to release the majority of people to get back to work? Or in a civilized society, should we be protecting the minority? And so we've decided to choose the third one of those three as way of illustrating the Barry-Johnson polarity map with you today. Now, one of the first things that's important to do is to identify the positive, or to anchor both ends of the polarity. If I was to describe one in positive terms and the other in negative terms, then already I've fallen into the trap of either or way of thinking. So releasing the majority, that might be about getting the majority of the population back to work for greatest economic benefit, a kind of utilitarian argument of making sure that the maximum number of people can return to work and we get the economy moving as quickly as possible. That might be at one end of the polarity. At the other end of the polarity, though, there are equally valid voices saying, actually, there are many people who are vulnerable in our society, and how do we keep them safe? That's not just the elderly or those with underlying health conditions. It's also people like me now, white middle-aged men in their 50s. It's also people from the BAME community who seem to be more susceptible to COVID-19 than others. So there's a tension here between releasing the majority and protecting quite significant minority groups rather within our society. Julie is going to assist me. So Poll A then, this is the benefits now of releasing the majority. So find the chat function. If you can be popping into the chat there, what might be the benefits of being at this end of the polarity? If we were to release the majority to get back to work, what benefits would we see there? Pop them in the chat. Julie can help me, and we're going to create a live polarity map as we go.
We've got rebuilding the economy, Mike.
Mm.
We've got mental health and vitamin D. Yeah, economy going up, faster economic recovery.
Yeah.
More tax available for the future. Hugging and social contacts. Yeah, we've got lots coming in. Education back and less loneliness. Goes in with social contact maybe, but it's a dimension on it.
Yeah. Now, in the interest of time then, so those would be, and I dare say there's a lot more as well, and if we were doing this and we had more time, we could keep going a bit further and a bit deeper. Those are all benefits then of Poll A, release the majority. Now I'd like you to think at the other end of that continuum, please. We've got protect the minority and significant minority groups. What would be the benefits of looking after these key minority groups in our societies?
Saving lives, not losing sight of historical perspectives. How about avoid further increase in inequalities, respect for equalities, or we can go out more safely if there are less people on the streets. That's okay. Control over NHS capacity.
So we can manage health.
Yeah, manage health, protect health, reduce anxiety that we have for other people, the elderly and loved ones. We can visit them, remind us all to keep volunteering, time to be creating a vaccine.
And we could keep that going, I dare say, for a lot longer as well. But in the interest of time, let's now look at the potential pitfalls or negatives of being at this end of the polarity. So what would the downsides or negatives be of a solution that focused on protecting the rights and lives of the minority.
Economic hardship, depression, restriction, rigidity. Yeah, we've got various on the economy, from being a bit difficult to tanking. Divisiveness, domestic tension and abuse, poverty and social riots.
Okay,
There
so
are lots of others still up there. Actually, it's got going really well.
Scapegoating, it just needed a little bit of time, didn't it, for the creative juices to flow. So if we move over into our final box now, so these are the negatives or the disbenefits of being at the release the majority poll. So what might be some of the downsides, the negative consequences of releasing the majority to get back to work?
Death. Thank you, Joy. NHS overwhelm, false start, stroke second wave. Yeah, being seen as reckless. Oh, that's interesting. Back to velocity, hypervelocity, speed picking up for everybody. An unwelcome return. And more pressure than decision makers know how to cope with. So I guess this decision-making overwhelm under pressure, possibly difficult to go backwards if we needed to. Somebody else has said problem for areas where there's poor NHS cover.
So I guess health systems overwhelmed in certain areas.
Yeah, and environmental concerns as well. People are coming up with at the moment, and well-being, being in a home environment where, as long as you've got a good one.
Okay, all righty. And again, we could continue that a little bit further if we wanted to. So having identified all of those issues, what we're trying to do now is, rather than fall into this idea of either or ways of thinking, but to try and get the best of both. Now, let's see, I was going to use a pen here. Let's see whether this works. So we're trying to get the best of all of these, the benefits at both ends of the polarity, rather than an either or way of looking at it. As you look across ways then, where I've drawn that butterfly there, can you see solutions or highest hopes that would capture the best of both? So what the question here is, what would be your highest hope if you were able to have the best of both here? We would try and have all of A, or as much as A as we could have, and as much of B. What would be our highest hope for any potential solutions, policy, steps that we could take?
Societal change, the most normal life for the maximum number, and there's some comments coming up about equity, so trying to have an equitable society. The vaccine, somebody said, I've missed some going up. People at the centre of decision making, reframing, doing things differently, creativity, and valuing what's really important.
Now, this is really creating a lot of...
Guys can change the world.
Okay, so we can really see, however dark things are, yeah, there are some opportunities here to get the best of both and really reframe some of the choices we might be making. Okay, so we've looked at how do we get the best of both here, and what would our highest hopes be. Those might be, however many bullet points we've got there, 6 or 7, ways in which you could then apply that acid test of what's in that highest hopes box to potential solutions that policymakers or even our organizations or us come up with. Similarly, what we want to do is we want to avoid the worst of all worlds. We could have a deepest, darkest fears box at the bottom of this, and Johnson would suggest you do that. But in the interests of time today, as you look across the worst of both ends of those poles, what would be territory that we definitely want to avoid? What would be the worst of all worlds, our deepest, darkest fears? Pop some of them in the chat, and let's see what we come up with there.
Social breakdown, Big Brother.
Yeah, so we get riots, Big Brother, economic collapse, deaths, greater inequalities. Yeah. So these would be all things: lack of trust, failing trust in Yeah, I guess policymakers, fear. So these would be watchwords, touch points to certainly make sure that any of our solutions we were coming up with did not fall into or trigger these deepest, darkest fears. And what we're really trying to do with this tool is to say, how can we get solutions that keep the butterfly in the top two quadrants and make sure that it doesn't fall down into the bottom two quadrants. So thank you for your participation there. On the version of the slides we put up on the website, we'll include your thinking there. But if you're now looking at the tool, and okay, that was interesting to do it for something that is affecting us all today, but in terms of taking it away, you might want to, in your journal, in your diary, whatever sort of reflective practice you use, think, what dilemmas or tough choices are coming up or arising for you right now? Is this in fact a problem to be solved? It's a Lech v London type issue, beach versus mountain, or is it in fact a polarity, something that is endemic within your organization, within your field of work, where there is a polarity at play, and how might you be able to use this tool in the service of surfacing that polarity and potentially navigating it? You might want to reflect, has today's exercise and thinking about different perspectives caused you to have new insights into other people's perspectives, or where they might stand on a particular issue that's a dialogue within your family or your workplace at the moment? Or has there been anything else that you've noticed as we went through this exercise? We've got some resources as per usual. They're on the MDV website if you want to have a look. I've also suggested this week some reading for you as well. There's a very short Harvard Business Review article called Both and Leadership, this idea of the best of both, published in 2016. For those of you that have access to the HBR, you might want to look that up. Brian Emerson, who I mentioned, quite a nice, digestible, relatively thin book here, Navigating Polarities, using both and thinking to lead to transformation. And I also mentioned our colleague Karen Ellis's book, Upgrade, Building Your Capacity for Complexity, which speaks to some of the underlying developmental capacities that we might use to navigate complexity. If you're able to, do stay on the call and join us and join Julie Allen for her digestive and reflective session. We'll just have a short interlude and then I'll hand over to Julie.
Okay, welcome to those of you who are choosing to stay on the call, and thank you. And my goodness, that was a lot of great thinking going on in that chat box there. So thank you all for that engagement. And yeah, I might want to do a little bit of shaking around and wiggling in place. For the digestive today, our normal digestive process is to just have a little moment of preparation. Then the middle portion is going to be about perceiving. I'm going to give you an opportunity to think about something you'd like to think about from multiple viewpoints, which I'll introduce. And then we'll be looking at new views in a slightly poetic manner, because I like to finish with a poem. So the preparation, really, I mean, this is the thing, we're the people doing the perceiving, aren't we? So just take a moment to notice how you are at the moment, and to settle in your seat, or if you're standing, settle with your weight to the ground. And the best way we know, the simplest way of getting our system on board for ourselves is through the breathing. And we do this each time. And the breathing of 4 in is what we choose to do. And 6 out. And in again for 4. And out for 6. You can find a 7-11 as well, but in the interests of some people not always having the great breathing they'd like at the moment, 4 and 6 will do that lovely supporting job for us. So keep that breathing going. And as you're doing that, if you don't need to use your mouth for talking, then you can afford to let your tongue just rest at the bottom of a nice relaxed jaw. And sometimes it's nice to put our hands palm down on top of our legs and notice skin and contact. So we put a lot of emphasis sometimes into muscles, joints even, but not noticing this the skin that covers our entire body. So relax in place. My quote that goes with this one actually is, we do not see the world as it is, but as we are. So we may as well do the best we can to be prepared to see the world as well as we can manage. So moving on, previously we've had a look at values, and we looked at those different ethics, law, logic and love, and 10 values, which were drawn from moraldna.org. And if you want to have a look at those, and also at the courage and love that we looked at, and indeed we had a digestive from Karen, it was a more somatically oriented, then please do go and look at the website or YouTube. If Mike, you could just bring up those 10 values so we can be reminded of them there. And then courage, to speak from the heart, the heartfeltness of courage rather than any gung-ho version of it, and to be balancing courage and love together. So we can take all that forward with us all the time into what we think about each day, including what we think about next. Today, I'm going to be talking about viewpoints. So here's a slide with a hammer, and if all you have is a hammer, then every problem seems like a nail. And so the reason for looking at different perceptual viewpoints, if you like, is that lovely word there, explicate, which you may or may not have come across. I like it because it's about the unfolding and the unraveling of things, the exploration, because there's an awful lot of information available, as you will have noticed. We can get quite overwhelmed by huge amounts of data and knowledge, and we have to sift it or don't, or ignore it, whatever we do, but we can have a lot of it. The richness, though, comes through the unfolding and how we engage with what is around us. And that's what the framework I'm going to look at today is to help us out with. So this slide has got 7 discourses on it, which I'm going to explain in a moment. And by discourse, I mean kind of a way of speaking about something. The interesting thing about this framework, well, among the interesting things, is that it could be about ontology, fancy word. That's about describing the realms or aspects of living. But it's also about epistemology, how we come to know. So there's sort of something about describing and something about feeling your way into things. And if you see that beautiful picture on the right-hand side with that vine, liana, traveling around, if you could imagine that you can see they're entwined, and if you can imagine each individual one as a circle, then those 7 things on the left-hand side are not in a hierarchical relationship with each other. They're more to be viewed as points or perspectives that you could arrange around in a circle like that, and then they're entwining. Let me give you a little description of each of them before inviting you to have a think from those different perspectives. So physiological, that's our physical state, like it says, it's of the body. Like sleep and sensation. What are the sensations? Maybe when you're doing the body related stuff, you feel sensations before you kind of start to label them. Actually, emotional then is a largely pre-verbal in mammals anyway, and it's subjective. It's a sort of mammal perspective, and then nominative, that's the naming of things, and that's where for us we start to get our form of actual language and words together, and we know the power of what we choose to call things. We might talk a bit about that later on. Normative then is about how we socialize, I suppose, how we understand what's okay, what's not okay, how we do group, how we understand the different cultures that we might be members of and the different norms around here. So it's a normative social process. We're social animals in that place. At 5, we've got rational, of the logic and thinking and agreed facts. This is in this framework. You can always have slightly wider, different definitions, but for this framework. And when I say a fact, I mean something like the boiling point of water at a certain elevation above sea level. You know, that's a fact. Sometimes if you have a little look through a newspaper with that in mind, you might find that's what is presented as fact isn't really. And therein lies all sorts of troubles we get ourselves into. Theoretical is our meaning making, the multiple perspectives, the stories we tell about things, and how we go about doing that, our theories. And then transpersonal, which in this framework, higher purpose. And I've heard Patricia describe it as, you know, beyond words, sort of where the words run out. For some people, that would be spirituality, not for others. For some people, it might be religion, but you could also say, well, actually, I think religion's quite organised, and then maybe that's more of a social normative process related to that transpersonal. But that's a basic thing of the 7. I hope they're making sense so far. You can tell me in the chat box if kind of like, are you kidding me? And I'll try and pick up on any questions. I'm having a little look at it from time to time. The next slide, I'm going to say a little bit more about this, comes with a health warning. Sorry, it's a table. But you can see down the left-hand side, it's just those same labels, but in the other order with a description. And I've just put this one here to have a little look at the ways of thinking about it in terms of leadership. So you can have a look. These slides are going to be available, so you can have a look in your own time. But those are examples of, if you're in a leadership position, they might be interesting to think about. So for example, in the normative one, you know, what kind of organisation or team is this? What are the rules for us around here? How do we behave towards each other? If you're in a leadership position, you might be a person who can think about these things in terms of how you influence them for what is useful and how you kind of co-evolve together with being influenced by them. You might be interested in finding out what a group that you lead knows, you know, what of it is factual and what is opinion. That sort of material goes into number 5, the rational. And then you might have an idea that would belong slightly more in the transpersonal of, you know, what's your purpose? What's your purpose at all? And in these times, these things are also interesting to think about. I mean, if you look at the physiological one, we did some breathing right at the beginning, and there's real benefit in the somatic practices. I'm sure any of you who practice them will find in the noticing of the physiology. If we look, say, at the naming one, that number 3, the nominative, you know, do we call something crisis? Do we call something opportunity? What is the benefit of having labels such as we're all in it together? So those are things about how we label. Your story about what's going on, that would be a theoretical one. And what is okay behaviour? That's quite a big matter of debate these days, and that would go into the normative one. I'd be interested, actually, you can use the numbers, can't you, from 1 to 7 if you want to pop them into the box of what you're noticing. You know, what's the one you've noticed most, or now you understand what these are? Be interesting just to know where we're at with these. Are we most noticing our physiologies? Are we most noticing the naming of things? Are we most noticing how people are thinking about things? Do pop those in the chat box and let us know what you're thinking. Here's an exercise for you. And this is to have a think about something important to you. And if you want to share what the thing is you're going to think of, you can, or some thoughts that come to mind, do. But please know, obviously, everybody sees what's in the chat box. And this is about taking something that you care about. It could be something to do with the pandemic and where it meets your own sense of leadership. Or it might be coming back to things that seem maybe to be opposing or in tension, like self-other or financial health, physical health. And just bring to mind something that it matters to you to have a little think about and to walk around the outside of. So we've got people thinking maybe about working digitally, thanks Cara and Elizabeth, boundaries with team, and people in leadership. Okay, from where other people might be thinking, so that's interesting. And maybe Mike, yeah, maybe people want to think about relationship with relatives or how relatives are, all sorts of things. Thank you. So here's the thing, sort of like the Rilke thing, it's good to live with the questions, you know, and so have a think from each perspective. That's what I'm going to invite you to do. I'll remind you what they're each about, and just let the idea float and visit those perspectives. And if you want to take a note for yourself of each one, do. So what questions arise for you? In the first instance, we're going to go to the physiological. So just sit with this knowing or this inquiry, wherever you are, and think about the physiology. Thank you, Mike. There we go. We've got a sort of a neuron thing going on there to remind you that this is kind of how things are impacting at the cellular level. Of course, in order to be able to write something down, you end up having to translate, but do your best to see if you can kind of get it. What do you get in your body when you think about the thing that you care about to be considering now? Just your top thoughts and noticings, because you can come back to this later and do a more thorough job. Stress levels on screen awareness. Yeah. Okay, next up, emotion. So thinking, there we go. Look, are we cracking up or not? The one in the middle's got a smile. When you think about the emotions that you're thinking about, so what emotions stir you? Are you moved by personally? Or maybe what do you see in others in this situation? It's lovely to see and lovely to know that we're all busy with things, aren't we? Okay, number 3. Number 3 is labeling, nominative. There we go, nice little filing cabinet. That's to symbolize maybe the words that are used for things, you know, and what label you give to things may be different from what other labels might be available. But just think about what labels come, what will be written on the ticket and tied on, and consider how useful or not useful you find those. And next, we're going to that social part. Got a nice chess set there because it's got rules. It's got people and rules and animals and buildings and all sorts in there. What are the norms associated with the situation you're thinking about? They could be many and various. They could be norms of behaviour, could be norms of patterns of communication. They could be all sorts of things. What normally happens has sort of been implicitly agreed and is regarded as usual. Have a little think about that. And then as we go on to the next one, here we go. Logic. Get one of those Rubik's things done with its twists and turns, thinking it through. What do we know? What of this is factual? What of it's opinion? Do you know which is which? Yeah, fake news, thanks, Fix. Indeedy. So how does that concept of what you actually know to be true apply to the situation you care to be thinking about? And then we're going to move on to the next one. The theories and stories. What's your story about all this? Do you know what other people's stories are about all this that you're choosing to think about now? How would you get to that multiplicity? What are you aware of? And can you hear the story that you are making that's coming from you about everything? It's a metacognitive act, so you're all fabulous if you're doing that. And the last one, where we step beyond ourselves and perhaps go beyond words. So I don't know how you do this one. Maybe you need to draw a little picture. How would you want to express that sense of what's beyond in relationship to what you're thinking about now? Values and honesty. Karen, it's a lovely story. Now, you might think there's going to be a big end point to all this, and I'm sorry to disappoint, because I'm going to be leaving that one with you. What questions have arisen for you as a result of going through those perspectives? And you can return to those perspectives anytime you like. And I hope you've enjoyed having a walk around the edges of these things. And thank you for sharing in the box. It's time to be closing. I was going to go for a poem that seemed to have a bit of an instruction in it to bring some discord together. But I looked on the websites, and because we're recording this, there were huge things about infringing copyright. So I've just put it here. You may already know it. Try to Praise the Mutilated World. Do go and look up that poem and have a look as an alternative. But bearing in mind the quote of the mind, once stretched by a new idea, never returns to its original dimensions. I'm going to go forward with that theme. I hope you've got some of that from what we've done today. And the poem for today is a slightly more light one, some of the philosophical ones we go for, but still lovely, by Julia Donaldson. It's called I Opened a Book, and I will read it twice, once for the words and once so the words can settle. I opened a book and in I strode. Now nobody can find me. I've left my chair, my house, my road, my town and my world behind me. I'm wearing the cloak, I've slipped on the ring, I've swallowed the magic potion. I fought with a dragon, dined with a king, and dived in a bottomless ocean. I opened a book and made some friends. I shared their tears and laughter, and followed their road with its bumps and bends to the happily ever after. I finished my book, and out I came. The cloak can no longer hide me. My chair and my house are just the same, but I have a book inside me. I opened a book and in I strode. Now nobody can find me. I've left my chair, my house, my road, my town and my world behind me. I'm wearing the cloak, I've slipped on the ring, I've swallowed the magic potion. I've fought with a dragon, dined with a king, and dived in a bottomless ocean. I opened a book and made some friends. I shared their tears and laughter and followed their road with its bumps and bends to the happily ever after. I finished my book and out I came. The cloak can no longer hide me. My chair and my house are just the same, but I have a book inside me. Thank you. And I'm going to hand back to Mike now to close for today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julie, as always, for leading us in that second part. Next week, next Avoca, we're looking at social resilience, and will be led by Karen Ellis. In the meantime, stay safe and stay well. Thank you.